Hello. I do wish the weather would make its mind up at the moment. It is incredibly muggy today, just humid and unpleasant. Anyway, I'm going to be showing you a commercial pattern this time, Simplicity 4219, and this is what is more commonly known as a square shirt. These were in use from, well, pretty much the medieval period up until the Victorian period. And while they've become more of a sort of staple of reenactment and fancy dress, they're still a practical shirt that you can wear every day if you fancy. Not particularly formal, you can wear them with a cravat if you wish, or as I've done here with a brooch, but they're fairly versatile, and especially if you're of the alternative fashion persuasion, they're quite useful. This one is made out of a nice mid-weight cotton. You'll have seen this fabric before in the garage makeover video if you've watched that. If you haven't, do check out the link up here, and if that doesn't appear, have a look in the description where I will also put the link for you. This is a fairly easy sew. It's not one of the most complicated patterns out there, and because it's so loose fitting, it's fairly forgiving of any mistakes you might make along the way. Now, I've had this pattern for so long that between the various house moves and life things that have gone on, I've managed to lose the instructions. So I won't be working from the pattern's instructions. If you have those, I advise you follow them. What you'll see here is how I've adapted my processes to put this shirt together, and how you can do it on just a standard sewing machine with really no special equipment. Just a little bit of hand sewing and a basic straight stitch throughout. If you're after a historically accurate shirt, this one will do in a pinch. It's not exactly what you want for that sort of thing, so it is best to do a little bit of research and figure out exactly what sort of shapes and fabrics that you want to be using. But if you're just getting into reenactment, it can be actually a really good pattern. It gives the right sort of look and the right silhouette, and if you do it in the right kind of fabric, like a lightweight linen, then most people aren't going to know the difference between this and a fully historically accurate one. As usual, there'll be a reveal at the end of the video, so do let me know what you think. Hopefully it'll be positive. This is not a shirt to everybody's taste, it's very much to my personal taste. And it has made me realise I don't have very many basics in my wardrobe, so I'm going to have to get some decent plain black wool and the like, and put some smart plain basics together so that my wardrobe becomes a little bit more versatile than it currently is. Anyway, on with the show.
Here we are, all the pattern pieces for this shirt cut out and ready to go. In terms of complexity, this one is probably slightly more complex than the simple summer shirt I did recently, and a good bit less complex than the Victorian Edwardian shirt that I've done earlier in the channel. If you go into the description below, I'll put some links in there for those. So what do we have here? This piece is your sleeves. These three on the bottom are all cut on the fold, so they'll be twice as wide as that. So the sleeves on this are actually really large. That will make sense when we get into the construction. So you have two of those, you have one of the front panel. One change I've made from the original pattern is I've cut this neckline just a little bit lower. I need a little bit more room in the front of the neckline than the pattern gives as standard. And then this one is your back panel, which again, you'll cut one of those. This larger rectangle is the collar. You want two in the facing fabric, and then you want one in the interfacing fabric. That's what gives it the stiffness. And depending on how stiff a collar you want will depend what you use for that. You can use iron-on fabric if you prefer. I'm using just a standard interfacing fabric for this. Above that is the placket or facing. This is for the front of the shirt because it doesn't have any buttons. The only fastenings the pattern calls for are eyelets. I won't be using that, I have a different way of fastening these shirts. But you do still need that piece. This smaller rectangle, this thin one, that's your cuffs. You need 4 of those in the facing material and 2 of those in the interfacing material. again, depending how stiff you want the cuffs to be will depend exactly what fabric you go with. I've gone with the same as I've used for the collar. And then a little square at the top, there's 2 of those, and that is the sleeve gusset. Basically, that's the piece that goes where your armpit is, and it gives the sleeve its shape. On a modern sleeve, you would find that actually built into the shape of the sleeve itself. On this pattern and on this style of shirt, that's how it was done. A quick note on the historical use of these shirts. Square shirts have been around a very, very long time, and the reason that they get called square shirts is the pattern shapes are, in some cases, just squares, with the only exception being a cutout for the collar. This one is a more modern pattern, and this one is aimed more at fancy dress. But I've found if you take care with your finishing and you pick the suitable kind of fabric, what you then wear with the shirt determines how it looks. So if you avoid things like cheap, shiny satins, and instead make this in a really lightweight linen, perhaps, it looks like a more professional shirt. And it's close enough to a historical garment that you can get away with it if you're doing sort of historical reenactment and you haven't got access to the other resources. As we've done before, the shoulder seam is going to be a French seam. If you have an overlocker or a serger, all of these edges can be done with that, and then you just straight stitch everything. And then this garment goes together very, very quickly. I prefer to do it this way, so even when my overlocker's working, this is the way I prefer to do it. So we've determined which is the front and which is the back, and I want these seams to be rolled over towards the back rather than the front. So I trim this seam down on this side to half, like so. And then you have the seam line just there. You can just make it out. It's difficult to show anything on this fabric, unfortunately. But you take the long side, which is the front, and you bring that down to meet your sew line, and then roll that again, and then you sew along this edge here. So then you get 2 lines of stitching all the way along. So we do that for both shoulder seams, and that will make the front panel of the shirt just one flat piece. After you've sewn the shoulder seams, give them a press, just make everything nice and tidy. This fabric's so busy, any minor mistakes that I'm going to make just aren't going to show up, which is nice. Next important bit is sewing this piece on. Now on this shirt, instead of buttons or any sort of fastenings, or like it being 2 halves on the front that overlap, this one just has a slit down the front which allows you to get the shirt on and off. On the pattern there would also be eyelets down each side, and then you'd lace it up. I'm not a big fan of that, so I tend to just go with a split and then wear a brooch or a cravat, or nothing, depending on what I'm actually wearing the shirt with. So the important thing to do with your front panel is fold the front panel in half and fold this in half. That will give you your centre line, and then pin or mark your fabric however you prefer, so that you know where you're going to sew, because we're going to run a line of stitches down one side of the pins and then turn around and come back up again. and there'll be a very, very narrow gap down the middle. Just enough so that we can actually turn the fabric the right way out. If you have an overlocker, the pattern suggests just overlocking these raw edges. I would recommend the same. However, I'm not using an overlocker, so I have pressed all of these seam allowances over, and once this is cut out and turned round, I will then top stitch this, because any stitching I do is going to disappear into this fabric pattern. So the two narrow seams sewn together, I could then turn and press it. I was going to show you this, but it was just proven to be a little bit fiddly, wouldn't stay in place while I was trying to record, so that's why I haven't. The important thing to remember, when you sew down this line, you'll come across just like 2 or 3 stitches at the bottom and then go back up the other side. When you've got this corner here, to prevent it from bunching badly, you just need to cut 2 diagonal lines out to the corners of your stitching from the centre line that you cut. So like a really long upside down Y. Once you've done that, you can turn it so that the facing comes from the front to the back, and then press all your edges. If you're doing top stitch like I am here, it's a good idea just to pin the facing down, just to stop it walking around as you're trying to just sew this on. And you're just doing a top stitch all the way around, back up to the other end, and then press it, and then that's done. We'll be ready for the collar to go on. There you go. You can't really see the top stitching at all. It just disappears. So for a fabric like this where it's quite busy, this, you can get away with it. And on the inside, all of your raw edges are hidden, and that makes it washing machine safe, which is always nice. Collar next. Nice and easy. The important thing to remember when you do collars and when you do cuffs, the cuffs will be exactly the same process, is your facing fabrics, put those face to face, and then your interfacing, if you're using a separate one, don't put it between these two, because if you do, it'll be on the outside. That's probably the most important thing to remember. All we're going to do, sew around 3 edges, clip these corners so that you don't get that when you turn it the right way out, and then a press. No top stitching required on this. It usually holds its shape really, really well. This bottom edge here is dealt with when it's sewn to the body of the shirt. With the collar turned and pressed, which, you know, I'm sure you've seen collars before. The interesting thing on this shirt is, unlike a more modern shirt that doesn't really have any gathering or pleats or anything around the collar, you just sew one part to the other. With this shirt, you have to figure out the best way to evenly gather the fabric of the neck into the collar. And the way I choose to do it is I pin each end of the collar, so I know where my end points are. I then pin the center point on both the collar and the body, and I then figure out where the center point is between the center of the collar and the edge of the collar, which is here, and I pin the shoulder seam there. Then I gather these baggy sections. So you put a running stitch through by hand, or use the gathering stitch function on your machine if you have one, and that just reduces all of this fabric into these sections. Once you've got it all gathered and pinned, you then sew over it as normal. It is quite fiddly, but it is important on the fit. If you don't do this and you just try and like fold it like that or something, it doesn't fit right. Gathering is really the best way of doing this particular section. So I've done all the gathering on here, and again, this fabric is brilliant because it hides whatever you do. Now, once that's done, you sew the collar onto the body, but you only sew the outside and the interfacing if your interfacing lies separate. You don't sew the inside for one good reason, which is this edge needs to be turned under, and then you can either hand stitch, which gives you a nice invisible seam, or in my case, because this fabric is very good at hiding stitches, I've folded and pinned this down, and I'm just going to top stitch along here, and that will catch all the raw edges and the seam itself will be basically invisible. It also saves me a bit of time doing it this way. Collar is now attached. You can just see on the inside some of the first seam visible, but the only people who's ever going to see that is you folks watching this and me when I put the shirt on. The rest of the time you just see the outside and the seam is practically invisible, which is good. So that's the collar now attached and the two halves of the body done. Our next stage is to do the sleeves. And you can see on here where the gathering just gives you some fullness, so it means that all of the upper part of the shirt is actually quite comfortable. You have a lot of room in it. And when we do the sleeves, we'll be gathering here on the top of the sleeve and again on the bottom where it joins the cuff. But so far this is turning out really well. I love this fabric. It is very striking. It's actually sewing up a lot better than I thought it would. Design wise I thought it might be a little bit much, but it looks like it's just about right. On the sleeves, before you put them on the body, you need to put in the gusset piece, which is this little square. The first time you do it can be a little bit confusing, but once you've got it, it's really straightforward. All you do is you turn your sleeve inside out and then you pin one side and sew that, and then do the other one afterwards. Try not to cross over when you get to the corner at the bottom here. You'll have two seams meeting. Try not to cross over here, have them meet up, because that will make the next stage easier. Here's one I prepared earlier. We're just using an ordinary straight stitch, no fancy stitches here. Because of the shape involved, it's quite tricky to do it any other way. I will do a whip stitch just around here, just to prevent the fraying, and then the main seam on the sleeve, that will be done as a French seam. A little bit fiddly at the top here, but it can be done. Unlike other French seams that we've done, this one we're basically doing inside out. The seam's done in exactly the same way. What changes is the raw edges of the seam are on the inside of the sleeve rather than the outside. This just makes the transition into the gusset at the top a little bit easier, a little bit tidier. When you're mixing and matching different seams, which you sometimes have to do, it's always best to keep all your raw edges on the same side, because that way you've got no weird transitions happening. When you do sleeves, it's quite tricky the first few times that you do it to get the hang of it, but you want to make sure, let's put the needle down in the fabric, you want to make sure that as you sew you don't catch the other side of the sleeve, and the way you do this is you sort of pull this side back, so you've just got this fabric down here, and I usually gauge it by sewing about a pin's length, checking the fabric's clear, and then sewing another pin's length. As you go along you'll get your fabric bunched up here and here, and you have to focus in sort of this area. I'll just do a little run and demonstrate. So we've gone about a pin's length, and I'm just checking underneath that the fabric isn't caught where it doesn't need to be. And you can see it's starting to bunch at this side. Always stop with your needle down in the fabric. That way, if anything moves, you're not going to lose your place. and go whatever speed is comfortable for you. This machine's a little bit tricky to control on the speed. It has its own ideas sometimes, but we manage. Now you can see how the fabric bunches at the top here, and I sort of have this clear working space in the middle, and this is really the only section that you want to be worried about. And as we get to where the gusset is, we'll finish off by just going back a couple of stitches just to secure that point. There we go. And if that's all gone well, as this has, then you haven't caught any of the other side of the fabric, and you have a nice, basically invisible seam. Once you have the sleeves turned the right way out again, you can now see what the gussets actually do. They turn into little triangles, and that bit goes under the armpit and just gives you that extra movement that you need. You can make these shirts without those pieces, but I'd strongly advise against it because you get a weird sort of pinching around the shoulder, which just isn't very comfortable, and it makes the sleeves move a bit strangely. So these are quite an important little piece. Doing it this way means that you use a lot less fabric. That was one of the key things with square shirts, is it reduces the amount of waste that you have. The first thing you want to do is mark out that point there, which is your fold line on the sleeve. This is your seam line on the bottom. So you want to put a pin or a mark in on that point. That means when you transfer the sleeve over to the body, you can line that point up with the shoulder seam. That's quite important for keeping things balanced. Now, depending on which size of this you make, this next measurement will vary. On me, the sleeve depth, which is from the shoulder seam down to the bottom of the gusset here, is 11 inches. So you need to get all of the extra fabric down into that seam. And that's where your gathering comes in. Your gusset section isn't gathered. That has to stay plain like that. And I start the gathering like in the top half of what's left. And that means you have the most amount of room actually on the crown of the shoulder, which is where the most movement is, and that's where you want all of that gathering to be, ideally. So I'm going to gather this, which is just you use a running stitch, and just do it by hand very quickly, and then smoosh it all down until it fits into the seam. Just quickly, I'm going to show you how I do these gathers. Depending on what I'm doing and how particular you need to be, sometimes I use 2 rows. Because this is a fairly loose, informal thing, I'm just using the 1 row, and it's just a plain running stitch. Now, when you do a running stitch like this, it's always best to use a contrasting thread. And in my wisdom, I picked up the white because, well, the fabric's like a black ground. I thought that'll show it really well. And completely forgot I'm doing the inside, which is mostly white. All you need to do for a running stitch is you just stamp the needle in and out. Be as careful or not as you like, depends on the garment you're making. And you end up just with a few stitches loaded on the needle like that. Then pull the thread through, and as you pull it tight it will gather the fabric for you like magic. Just pay attention to where your loose end is. You don't want to pull that all the way out until you're ready to actually pin everything in place. Once you've got the gather as you'd like it, you can either use a basting stitch just to hold everything down, or as I'm doing, just use pins. Again, personal preference. This allows you to squish all of that excess fabric down so that all of this here will match this here. And you just sort of shuffle the material around until you get a moderately even spreading. For a shirt like this, you don't have to be super duper perfect. You can be fairly laissez-faire about it, which I am being. Also, this fabric hides everything, so there is literally no point in me wasting my time making this beautiful and perfect, because you'll just never see it. I did make a very, very slight mistake, and it's been ages since I did this. But I bet you can't tell what it is looking at it. That's a fairly important lesson with sewing. If you make a mistake, you have two options. Unpick it and do it again, or own it. And more often than not, I go with option 2, because, well, I don't realistically have enough time with the deadline to unpick these and redo them. I'll show you the mistake. When you do French seams, normally you don't need to worry about which side is which when you turn it over, and I hadn't engaged my brain. So instead of it being the body of the shirt, which is nice and flat and smooth, I ended up using the gathered section to turn over, which means it's not a very tidy seam inside the shirt. However, what it does mean is on the outside of the shirt you get, it's very subtle, but you get a little bit of a detail here where this seam doesn't sit quite as flat, and it just makes it look more like the sleeves are sort of poofing out of the body of the shirt, and I quite like that. I think it goes with everything else that's fairly excessive about this. Two things left. One is to put the cuffs on, a little bit more gathering involved, and the other is just to do the hem, and that's a very straightforward, easy job. One of the trickier aspects with doing shirts is getting the cuffs right. Now this pattern's a little bit unusual in that there are no plackets or openings. If you look on this sleeve, you can see there's the cuff there, and then there's this opening here, which just allows you to get your arm in and out a bit easier. On this shirt pattern, that doesn't exist. It is literally just this cuff section. Now that's never given me a problem, so I'm not going to alter the pattern. But you have to remember when you put the cuffs in, that when you set them, you don't just put the opening on the back seam here, because that's not where it is on a shirt normally. So the way that I do it is I hold the sleeve flat and I pin this point here, which is like the opposite to the seam. Then bring the pin and the seam together. So this is like you're folding it the other way, and you then have 2 points there. With the seam, it's really hard to show you on this fabric. With the seam here against the inside of the body, one of your folded points is then at the front and one is at the back, and it's the one at the back which is your cuff opening. So pop a pin in there. This then means when you put your cuff on, the cuff opening is at that side, so when you're wearing the shirt, that goes to the back of the sleeve, all of this material gathers down into this cuff. There's a lot of material. But that means then that the opening on your sleeve is where you expect it to be, and it will sit just on your wrist bone here, as it does on any other kind of shirt. We're on the home straight now. Both of the cuffs are on. You can see how much fabric you have to actually gather down to get into these. They're pinned in place at the moment. I'm going to hand sew the inside seam, it's just easier. It allows me to finish off this section here as well. This is probably the worst part of this pattern. It's the most amateurish. But it works, and you know, good enough is good enough. The other item I'm going to address is the last bit of machine sewing. Now on the pattern, the back is slightly longer than the front. That's fairly normal for shirts. What I don't like is the step. I don't like how this looks. I don't like split sides on shirts either. So, personal preference, because I don't like that step, the thing I like to do is take the high point at the front and just curve it round to the back, and then I can do the entire hem just in one seam. I've completed the hem. That marks the end of the machine sewing on this garment. So now I just need to do the hand sewing to finish everything off. There isn't anything to do on the collar. The collar's all completed. Shoulders are done. There's some pressing to be done, obviously. So all I have left is the hand sewing on the cuffs just to fasten the lining, which will hide all the raw edges, and then the buttonholes on the cuffs for the cufflinks.